This week on Givers, Doers, and Thinkers, we talk to Hillsdale professor Bill McClay about his explosively popular book, Land of Hope. We talk about how to achieve a genuinely balanced perspective when doing history and the need to avoid reducing history to a morality play. We talk about what Bill thinks we most often get wrong about American history, and we speak about his experience on the American Semiquincentennial Commission. Let's go. Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers, a podcast on philanthropy and civil society. I'm Jeremy Beer. It's great to have you with us. We are recording on April Fool's Day, April 1st, 2025. This is not a joke. Bill maybe will have some jokes for us. I don't know. But I'm pleased to have as our guest historian Wilfred McClay, the Victor Davis Hanson Chair in Classical History and Western Civilization at Hillsdale College. 30 years ago, Bill published his award-winning book, The Masterless, Self and Society in Modern America. And most recently, he is the author of the best-selling book, Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story. Aside from his writing and teaching, which have won too many awards for me to mention here, Bill has served and still serves on a number of boards. He is the chairman of the board at the National Association of Scholars, on the board at the Jack Miller Center as well. And most importantly, and appropriately for what we're doing this season on this podcast, he is also a member of the official U.S. Semiquincentennial Commission. So we're very glad to have him with us here today. Bill, how are you doing?
I'm fine. You made me tired just thinking about these things, these responsibilities that I don't always adequately discharge. But
I didn't even mention all of them. I tried to lighten your load a little bit.
Okay.
But, yeah. Well, let's. I have Land of Hope, by the way, for those who haven't seen it over my shoulder here. It's sold many, many, many copies. Really, I don't know if you're shocked by its.
I was and am. Yeah. By the way, I want to mention the other great thing you have over your shoulder is some kind of representation of the state of Indiana.
That is true. Thank you for noticing.
Really, That's really nice. A friend of mine, Richard Ryan, who you probably know, refers to Indiana as the virtuous state.
Well, he couldn't be more correct.
Yeah.
Well, but Land of Hope, I want to make sure I encourage people to, if you haven't bought this book, or you're one of the few at this point, because so many people have it. So get it for yourself, for your kids, for your school, for anybody you think needs to sort of understand or would profit from understanding American history better. It's written very accessibly. It's not too long. It's 350 pages maybe or so.
Like that, yeah.
Yeah. So
it's meant to be read. It is not.
It's meant to be read. That's right. It's actually meant to be read. One of those books is meant to be read. Tell me why. Like, what led you to write another general history of America, and to what extent was like the 1619 project in your mind as you're doing this, or was it written completely independently of that phenomenon?
It was written independently of that, and actually, the 1619 project was released after the book had come out.
Okay.
But the 1619 project didn't occur in a vacuum. It reflected some trends of scholarship over the last 30 years or so. And I have to say, even though it was a bit of a shock to me that the New York Times put its institutional weight behind something that was as mendacious and really inaccurate as the 1619 project was, the general drift of it wasn't that surprising. So what led me to do this? That's a very good question, because it's not anything I ever thought I wanted to do. There's a long version of the story. I'll skip that, but basically, well, I'll give you a little bit of it. What precipitated it was when the College Board, which is the organization that does advanced placement testing and offers accreditation for courses. They came out with a revised version of their American history, AP US history test. And it was quite shockingly revisionist, so to speak, in leaving out a lot of things having to do with constitutional history, diplomatic history, and intellectual history, is my field, and even political history, and emphasizing, the economics of the slave trade and things like that much more prominently than, say, something like the ratification debates over the Constitution.
Right.
Appeared entirely. That's where the Federalist Papers appear. So there were a number of us that were really very concerned about this. And we got together and produced a letter, an open letter to the College Board, with sort of entreating them to back off from these changes, which were damaging and false for reasons that we provided in the letter. It's actually a really respectful letter under the circumstances. And what they did, they actually did back off for the time being from a lot of the changes that they made. But it was soon brought to our attention that the big textbook manufacturers like Pearson, McGraw-Hill, they had already revised their American history texts in line with what they anticipated to be coming out of the changes in the AP test. So, and I think they figured, well, it may have a little setback, but eventually, because the march of progress only leads in one direction. People started saying, well, people in our group started saying, well, we need an alternative text. We needed one for a long time, actually.
And there was no extant, no sort of unpoliticized.
Not really. There were some that were not as politicized, but they were also unintelligible. They literally couldn't, unreadable. I couldn't read them, and I discovered this when I started working on Land of Hope. But anyway, I finally was talked into doing it, and that somebody needed to write such a book. At first, I said, I absolutely agree with you. I hope you find somebody, and I thought that would take care of the problem, but no, people kept coming back, and so in some ways, I won't say by popular demand, but by the demand of a number of well-placed people whom I greatly respect, I was cajoled into doing it. Once I was about, and really, Jeremy, at first, it was just the hardest thing to do because I wasn't used to writing that way. I wasn't used to, I like to think my writing was intelligible, but this was, I knew that what I had to do was to break through to a much more limpid, much more accessible style. And no academicisms allowed.
Right.
And no references to varying interpretations. No, you had to. Plus, my publisher kept saying, we're really hoping this will be the antidote to Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn, for your viewers and listeners, being the political scientist, not a historian, who wrote A People's History of the United States, which is a fairly egregious work. I can't think of any historians, no reputable historians, that have ever said, Howard Zinn's did a good, reliable history. They like it. It's 12 million copies. They're very left, but they won't. They won't. They won't
vouch for the historical.
That they won't go that low. It's the same with history. Anyway, and Howard Zinn, I think, has sold 5 or 6 million copies. It's a lot of copies, and I find friends who are big fans of Land of Hope. They say, gosh, my kid is using Howard Zinn in his school. Public schools, private schools, it's still out there. So anyway, I came to the conclusion, yes, there had to be something better. So I started in on it. And it took me a month to write the first chapter. Um, but once I got a handle on the right diction, the right tone, the right pitch, it flowed pretty well because I've been teaching American History Survey courses for umpteen years. And, in many ways, my notes from those years reflected, I couldn't use the notes directly, but they reflected the outlook on American history that I had that I brought to bear in the book. So by the time I finished, I was really liking it. I was enjoying myself, and I often wonder if that's evident to readers that hey, he's really getting into this. But
no, it does read very, very well. You're right. You've sort of stripped away the academicisms and the sort of throat clearing and the references to the literature and all that sort of thing.
And there's only 2 or 3 places where I say, well, look, historians differ about this issue. The Great Depression, for example. I wasn't going to go out with, you have to mention the Keynesian interpretation, which I personally think is mostly wrong, but I'm not an economist. You have to give some sway to it because that's still the dominant view. But I also gave the monetarists, the Milton Friedman, that view, and I hint at some others. So it does. I think it's right to say that we don't have a settled interpretation of the Great Depression, and in those instances, I felt I had to do a little bit of academic argle-bargle. But in the beginning of the First World War, I think that's definitely still contested. And it's something you have to have within the scope of an American history text, even though we had nothing to do with starting the thing. So, but otherwise, it's plain language. I wanted to and I've been very gratified by letters that I get from people, those ordinary people. Sometimes they don't identify where they're from, which bothers me. I get a letter from somebody, all it says is Joe Schmo at google.com or gmail.com. But it's very gratifying to get these people who say, finally a history book I enjoy reading, that's intelligible, that doesn't go into too much detail. And that was part of the mission too, is to make it short, as you said. But you also have to have a point of view. And my view of American history is, even though I have many reservations about things that we have done, things we are doing, catch me on a on a Tuesday or a Thursday, I'm very down on the present condition of our culture, but there's an ultimate affirmation and the sense of hope about the future. And when I was writing it, and that almost seemed, like T.S. Eliot's famous line about gathering up, shoring up our fragments against our ruin. I don't think I have it right, but it doesn't seem quite as desperate now as it does. But I thought about, I've raised children and we homeschooled our children, so I thought they studied history with my wife and me. And how do I want to teach this stuff? And I don't want to teach it as one long parade of Confederate flags and Klansman hoods. That's not America in my experience. That's not. So I think the hyper, almost pathologically critical view of American history that is so much the norm in the academic profession. I'm not exaggerating at all when I put it. It's not only false, but it's unhealthy. It's unhealthy for young people to grow up with the sense that they're living under a really evil regime, in which they should never let you behave themselves and follow the laws. What logic comes from that? I think at least some point I had dinner with a friend new friend. I didn't know him very well, and it was very interesting what I was doing. He said, I believe if if young people grow up believing that they live under a bad regime, it affects their soul in a way that is very difficult to heal, very difficult
Yeah.
to change. And I had not thought about what I was doing in that way. That this is about,
Right.
The study of history, especially one's own history, is partly an act of moral formation. It's how are you forming the sensibilities of the young with regard to the country at which, to the extent we are still a republic or aspiring to be one, we expect them to participate in. I do try to give weight, and I think sufficient weight, to the negative side of American history. So there are those for whom you can never get enough of the negative side. So but I've gotten remarkably little criticism. I'm almost none about my treatment of slavery and racial, white supremacy, racial discrimination, Jim Crow, et cetera. I have gotten a bit of criticism that I don't do more with Native Americans. And I think that's actually a valid criticism. We are in the middle, I want your audience to know, of doing a second edition and giving me the opportunity to beef up some parts and also to take out some of the academicisms that just somehow crept in. So I'm having a lot of pleasure taking those out.
Yeah.
I think I can do better. Could do better in that department. I don't think it's.
Well, it's hard to compress an entire American history into 350 pages.
Definitely,
to say the least.
It's a constant issue of trade-offs or triage. Triage is my favorite image because it's the triage of the lifeboat. You put too much detail in, that the boat will sink. So you got to know what to throw out.
Right.
And sometimes you throw out your, there's a saying, I forget who, the British poet who said, you must kill your darling. And in the process of editing your work, you have to take out that image, that comparison, that name or whatever that you just thought, that's so brilliant of me. You got to take it out. More often than not, you fall in love with your own imagery. So there's a lot of that. But the end result, I've been very pleased, not just by the sales, but the reception of it has been so positive.
Well, and as you say, it's the contrast with these sort of unremittingly, pathologically critical is exactly the right phrase to use, in the way that American history is not just presented at the sort of elite colleges or universities, but I think all the way down now, all the way down to the first time American history is presented in you think sane public school that you send your kids to. It's all permeates the curriculum, does it not? It is sort of whole shaping.
I think there's assumption even by my colleagues on the left, which is to say most of my colleagues around the country. There's an assumption that somewhere out there, somebody, Miss Marple somewhere, is teaching the sort of basic account of American history that we get to counterpunch against. And nobody's home. Miss Marple has become Mr. Marple or whatever he said and gone to California, but there is nobody doing that.
It's all a counterpunch. They're punching counterpunching against a punch that doesn't exist.
Yes.
Even in Texas.
Yes. So I think that said, I feel obliged to be as balanced as I can and not a sugar-coated view of our history. But, just this, I think what people, and actually a lot of the work that's being done has within a limited frame validity. I know that these people are careful. Some of them are not careful scholars, but a lot of careful scholars do work, which I want to ask them, just what did you think you were doing? People are still writing books against George Washington, which to me is, it's not just a sort of patriotic sacrilege. It's stupid. What kind of heroes do you think the human race has to offer if George Washington is not a hero? So I think the perspective of the book is as important as anything else. That when I look at someone like Jefferson, who, and Jefferson's a great example actually, because he's obviously a great man with what are, by our standards today, great faults, and they were actually faults by his standards. He was utterly convinced of the moral wrongness of slavery. He famously said, "I tremble when I consider that my God is just and his justice will not sleep forever." He's talking about slavery when he does that. That's at the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, those words. It actually shows that Jefferson would talk about God from time to time, and he felt so moved. But that's another issue. But I think, to acknowledge the greatness of Jefferson, particularly in his support of religious liberty, support and the Declaration, maybe above all else, it's not to deny that he had other faults. And actually, he wasn't that great a president. He was smart enough to do the Louisiana Purchase, and I give him high marks for violating his own constitutional principles to do that. As the saying goes, sometimes you have to rise above principle, and that Jefferson did that in that case. You couldn't pass that up. Where would we be without Louisiana? So where would the chicory in our coffee come from? but seriously, I think learning, there's a lack of maturity in the way our history is taught, in that when you find some flaw in someone's makeup, well, that's it for them. They're canceled, they're gone. And I mean, the standard has become so ridiculously high. Back when statues were coming down in 2020 and 2021, they were tearing down statues not just of Robert E. Lee or
Frederick Douglass, as I recall correctly.
Frederick Douglass. Yes. Lincoln, because Lincoln, of course, was not really clearly in favor of racial equality in all senses, including social equality. Right. He was a man of his times, at least that extent. And it's interesting to me that Martin Luther King Jr. has not been canceled because of his what his FBI files show about his dealings with women. I'm glad he hasn't been. I think he's an admirable figure and deserves place in the American political pantheon. But it's
the selective application here.
It's selective application. Yes.
What's the aspect of the politicization of history that seems to have really metastasized in the last, 20 or 30 years? It seems to me even more than before. What's one or two things that irritate you the most? Like, I can't believe
all this land grant business, where you have say
land statement business.
Whatever they call it. Land statement.
Explain to people what that is. Normal people may not have encountered that yet in the world.
You go to a concert, let's say, in I don't know, somewhere in New Mexico, let's say, and I won't do Arizona. We'll say in New Mexico. Someone comes out and says, "Well, before we do this, we want to acknowledge this land once belonged to the Choctaw or whatever." They weren't Choctaw. Mexico, but
the Pueblo Indians, you might say, in New Mexico.
It's this sort of, let's have our moment of our vitamin G guilt, and then we go ahead with things, and it's where we pay our obeisance to sins that we had no role in committing, and probably our forebears, back as far as we remember, had no role in And actually, the history is often very bad. I mean, badly done. So
That's what bothers me the most. I would say, like, land originally occupied, let's say, by Navajo or something. Well, the Navajo weren't here till 1300 or 1400, let's say,
right.
where we might be
How
standing.
far back?
And they took it from somebody else, who probably took it from somebody else, who took it from somebody else. It's a sort of ahistorical
Yes.
view that goes all the way down. That's so irritating.
Yes.
Like you say,
No,
I agree. The land statement thing is so
I-
meaningless and self-righteous at one and the same time.
But it's a way of saying the regime under which we live is not entirely legitimate.
Yeah.
And I think that's corrosive. Although it also makes people, a lot of people say, well, I don't care about anything that came before me. They have the opposite reaction.
Right.
It's sort of like deciding you're tired of hearing feminists rattle on about things, so you become Jeremy Tate. I mean, there are those are extremes.
You're right. The one kind of produces the other, and now
the one, and indeed,
Yeah.
and so I think a balanced perspective that recognizes that there's a tragic element, particularly.
Of course.
One of the best people on this is Tocqueville, as he is so good on so many things. He describes in the last chapter of Volume 1 of Democracy in America, he describes when he's traveling, he ends up at Memphis and he sees part of the Trail of Tears. He sees this, actually the Choctaws, now that I think about it, but he sees this miserable group of people, ill-clad, freezing and barefoot in many cases. And, this ordeal of their being removed to Indian Territory, what became Oklahoma. And there's no element of, well, these people deserved it. They're lesser beings. No, his Christian impulses kick in. And he describes it with great compassion. They knew that their ills were long-standing and irremediable. And he ends up sort of saying this is a great tragedy because nothing was going to stop the growth of modern European civilization, the westward growth. Nothing was going to be able to preserve their way of life.
And certainly not in the sort of culture of democracy that he identifies in America. Right? This is sort of somehow, this is somehow symptomatic of that.
And culture. I think we still don't know quite how to. I think it's still a problem. This is one of the reasons that I think I need to give more attention to it. It's still a problem in a way that race is not as much of a problem, even though it's all we hear about. I think we don't hear a lot about the issue of Native Americans, indigenous people, and I think that's, there were treaties broken,
a few
left and right. So
at least more than a few. There is a sense of inevitability to it, though, isn't there? Of this sort of just wave, the power and dynamism as you point out, a lot of the dynamism of American society kind of makes it so hard to stop.
I think it's really important that history not evolve into a kind of morality play. That's not to say history has no moral dimension, and certainly those of us who are Christians or Jews do think history has a moral dimension. That God is in some way involved in history, although whether we can tell exactly what he's up to,
perceive it, right?
But the morality play. I just saw a book the other day about another book about slavery, about how we should think about slavery. I should have thought that everything that could be said on the subject had been said, but getting all this roll out, publisher. It's not the only, and of course his position, the author's position, that appears to be um, we're it's the question at the heart of American civilization,
Mm-hmm.
and that's just ridiculous. I say that without any desire to say it's not
To
important.
minimize. Yeah.
And by the way, when I was growing up, we were taught American history. Slavery was very important. It was a cause of the Civil War.
Yeah.
Even in Maryland, they were taking that
Yeah.
position.
Yeah.
And it's not as if this has all been neglected.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, this sort of started crashing in on the scene and making slavery, this sort of new capitalism theorists who basically see
Yeah.
capitalism as an outgrowth of slavery. Again,
Yeah.
ridiculous. But
Yeah.
I think there needs to be a reset. And I was never so crazy as to think Land of Hope could be the beginning of that, but I feel as if it is. It is. It's
Yeah.
success way beyond anything I expected or dared to hope for.
Yeah.
Has given me hope
Yeah.
for
There can be a reset.
and by the way, I mean, I should talk a little bit for your audience about what I mean by the term "land of hope" runs
Yeah,
through
please
the
do.
whole book,
Yeah.
and it's not just a sort of sugar-coated. America is the candy land of human history. It's not like that, but it is. It is, first of all, the place to which most everybody that is here came here from somewhere else. I mean, in his or her lineage. Most of us came willingly. Some came in chains. But even they have in their beautiful sort of liturgy of song,
Mm-hmm.
are full of hope, full of the biblically inspired hope.
Mm-hmm.
But more generally, it's a land of hope in the sense that a place people have come because they thought it was possible to move beyond the conditions into which they were born.
Yeah.
Or they had a sense of adventure or pioneering spirit or whatever. But it's that sense things can be different, things can be better.
And there's something deeply Christian and deeply progressive in that sense, both
of those
right?
things. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And yes, and I think both of those things can become too involved in our definition of ourselves. That is to say, as Christians, and I'll speak as one, this world is not our home. This country is not our home. It's a pretty grand place to be for a time being, but it should never be the eschaton.
Right.
No, that's something entirely else. And progressive, need I say that the notion that being a land of hope means that that everything is constantly in need of improvement. That it's a world of orange cones everywhere you look. Everything is under construction. No, that's not a civilized way to live. We actually, I think, and this is something I'm probably going to have a little more of this in the second edition of the book. I think we really need to rethink our notions of progress, and as we look at how this technology is wrecking American youth, wrecking the art of conversation, wrecking many of the things that are dearest to us as part of our human endowment. And so these and of course, the technology that we're using to talk here is wonderful, but we don't have a sense of proportion about the use of it, especially younger people who are unsupervised.
Has that been an American trait to not have a typically American trait to not have a sense of proportion about technology?
I think so. I mean, there's a term a historian has devised. I can't think who it is, but the technological sublime, which is a kind of very high version of what we mean when we say that an app is cool. Uh, because the coolness in that sense,
Yeah.
like I would, and somebody singing the praises of a Cybertruck the other day.
Mm-hmm.
It could be self-driving if you want to. I thought, I don't want to have a self-driving. Well,
Yeah.
you can have. Let's say you live in Michigan. It's a cold day. It's snowing. You can call your car out of the garage, across the street, and come up the front door, get the heat up to a certain temperature, heat the seats, all while you're sitting in the comfort of your home. And I thought to myself, now that would be, and more.
Right.
But
Right.
there is that aspect of a technological fix of something that requires many different steps. For us, all you have to do is push a button step. I do think we're also, it's amazing how quickly we pick things up. I mean, I reflect on how every now and then I'm going through my files and I find letters that I used to write. I used to write letters and keep copies of them, because it was one of the ways I augmented my poor memory. I would make carbons. I've got files and files of these green carbons for all the letters I wrote going back to before I was in graduate school. And of course, at some point they just stop because email comes in. Right. And it's just amazing how the most ordinary people in American life are all, they know what a QR code is. They know how to operate their phone better than I do, because I'm not that curious about all the apps. But so we are very adaptable. I think that's in our, I won't say, I hate the expression in our DNA, but it's in our blood. It's in our it's deeply embedded in our culture. Yeah.
And is it true, would you say too as well, this hope? I like the keynote here of the key motif of hope. That kind of what lies at the base too of just to some extent of Americans' penchant for forming this Tocquevillian penchant for forming voluntary associations, for always that there's a sense that there's hope for something to be better, either at a small scale or at a large scale.
Yeah,
not a fatalism, in other words.
Absolutely, and again, Tocqueville says this, that he doesn't only attribute this to Americans, but he thinks that it's really one of the most debilitating things about modern thought. And I don't know who exactly he has in mind. He's right about any number of modern things. Is the sense of determinism and reductionism, so that all class relations are a function of the means of production. And everything else, the ideas that people propound and all that, it's all a function of the organization of the means of production. Marx or Freud, Darwin, all of the great modern systems of thought are in some way efforts to rob us of our freedom, of the freedom of our will. And Tocqueville said, no, that is the one thing, liberty. He's a great proponent of liberty in the sense of freedom of the will, that we are free to make our world. And he admired that about the Americans. They didn't just sit around and say, oh, well, it's broken. I'll wait for the government to send a plumber. No, we'll try to do it ourselves if we have to. But, and yes, this voluntary associations, you don't see that anywhere. I mean, I haven't lived that much of my life abroad, but what I have, admittedly, was in Italy, which is not a place known for its organizational talents. But you don't see anything like it, and people can't conceive. Why would you? Why would you start a school? Don't you have schools already? And or the church would have schools, okay.
Right.
Although in a place like France, the Republican regimes did everything they could to drive the Catholic schools out of business. Um, so why there's a kind of acquiescence. Something I'm sure you know about because it's your line of work is that on the continent you hardly see any philanthropic foundations.
Right.
They're alien to the experience of the French. Just pick on the French.
Yeah.
I went to a talk once by a French admirer of American foundations. He just went on and on about how difficult it was to do anything like the legal structure as opposed to, but so is the cultural structure. Interesting point. When the great Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris was just redone and reopened, magnificently done. Well, when the fire first happened and they decided that they were going to rebuild it and not rebuild it as some kind of kitschy Pompidou Center, as it had been. The one good thing that Emmanuel Macron has done. The offers of money flooded in from American, wealthy Americans, not all of them Catholics or even believers, but and people were deeply suspicious of that. And in the end, I think they did accept some of the money, but not much. It was the French people prefer something like this to be built with public money. They prefer that.
Yeah.
And that's something very, very different from us.
Yeah. That is not in our DNA, to use a phrase you don't like.
Yeah, well, it's all right. It's okay when you use it.
Yeah.
The idea of a philanthropic foundation in some way violates their notions of Republican. That if you have, even if the rich people are doing
equality,
good, it's much better that it come out of the public purse. Go figure.
Let me ask you about one more concept that you bring up, because I wanted to make sure we touch on this before we go. I think one of the powerful themes you introduce is that of unsettlement. Like the history of the U.S., for good and ill, is one of unsettling individuals, communities, people, seemingly everything. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. That's it starts with, this wonderful sentence from Lewis Mumford that I just have, I repeated with every class I teach about American history, that the settlement of America began with the unsettlement of Europe. And I think it captures the ways in which, to put it in a somewhat less clear way, America is a province of Europe. We're not a child of Europe or the offspring exactly, but we are maybe in some ways a province that, or an offshoot, a byproduct. I'm not sure that there's any one phrase that quite captures it, but I love Mumford's phrase. And so I do follow that through, that there are ways in which unsettlement is, and I speak as a very conservative person. I prefer settlement to unsettlement.
Yeah. But
that unsettlement can serve larger purposes than just, let's shake things up. It can help to reorient, to liberate the energies of people that have not found proper outlet. There's some way in which one of the strengths of American life, and I find a lot of times foreigners. I just had a Romanian guy visit here, and he says, what I miss America is, there's not enough of the Tom Sawyer spirit. And I wonder, what do you mean by that? And what he's really talking about is our willingness to operate outside of institutions, to just float a raft down the river, or make things ourselves, to not to paint by numbers, but to refuse to be regimented. And told him one of my favorite sayings of G.K. Chesterton. I'm sure you know it. Is anything worth doing is worth doing badly,
Right.
and it's such a profound thing because, and yet we are in this culture that honors way beyond its deserts credentialism, people in the white coats with lots of letters after their name. That's what he was talking about, the Tom
Mm-hmm.
Sawyerism. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it is there's a creativity in America that comes out of the farm boy tinkerers that developed the automobile
Yeah.
industry, and
Right.
that sort of unstructured boundlessness, that
Yeah.
sense of the human energy without without constraints. That is a big part of what makes America so special and
Yeah.
exciting. And um, I think that's one of the reasons a lot of people are excited, more excited than I am, truthful, about the fact that we're now out in space again. We're
Yeah.
exploring the universe. That there's
Right.
something to the idea that Americans need a frontier.
Yeah.
Frederick
Yeah.
Jackson Turner, uh, and that's what Jack Kennedy ran for president on, the idea that we needed
Yeah.
that space was it. So maybe he was right.
So let's end then. Here we are. You remember the bicentennial in 1976. Here we are coming up on the semi-quincentennial, which I keep saying so I can remind myself how to say it, and maybe
Yeah.
a few people pick this up. You don't hear it out in the world. Like no
No,
one
no,
talks
and,
about
and we don't. We use it. We say America 250 now.
America 250,
Uh,
but even America 250, we really don't, which is why we're doing this season.
yeah,
Here we are. It's March 2025, or April 2025. You don't. If most normal people, you mentioned this is coming up, like, oh wow, you're right. That's amazing.
yeah.
What's your feeling as a member of the commission? What are you hoping might get accomplished now? You're just the third administration this commission's been under. What are you hoping might happen over the next several years?
Yeah. Well, I will tell you off the bat. This is no secret that I've been very disappointed in the commission so far, and until fairly
Mm-hmm.
recently, things have really
Mm-hmm.
started to turn around. It came into being in the I guess it came to be in the first Trump administration,
Mm-hmm. It's my
and
understanding.
I was not one of the original members, but I was added soon and after the beginning. Paul Ryan was speaker, so he was
Mm-hmm.
the one who nominated me on it. And, uh, it was completely consumed by internal politics, and I won't go into that
Yeah.
except to say it wasn't just ideological or partisan politics. It was there were two different Philadelphia groups that each wanted to sort of dominate the thing, and meanwhile, others of us are saying, hey, there is a country out there beyond Philadelphia. I mean,
It's always been hard for Philadelphians to understand, but yeah, that is the
I,
case.
in the fullness of time, we started to run out of time, and um, both sides are gone. The people who
Mm-hmm.
were basically perpetuating this struggle are gone. And things started to improve, believe it or not, when Joe Biden was elected, because there wasn't the monstrosity of the Trump administration for people to rail against. And strangely enough, Trump's reelection has, I think now people are realizing if we're not going to be doing something, he's just going to do it himself. And
Right.
it won't necessarily be what everyone in the
Yeah.
commission will like. It'll
Yeah.
be, I won't say what it's going to be, but
Right.
I think, um, so we're getting going a bit more. And those of us who are, really interested in, for example, the element of civic education in
Mm-hmm.
this, are really getting on. We had the person who, we don't have an executive director. We have
Okay.
had one. He stepped down because of the politics. We
Mm-hmm.
hired another one. He quit after a month or two. and we haven't had one since.
Okay.
But the woman who basically runs things is a Democratic pol of sorts, not an elected official, but from California. She's done a wonderful job. Rosie Rios, I should mention her name. I think she's been even-handed. We had a commission meeting in Alabama, and she and I were about the only people to show up. But she talked to the Alabamians like she was a sister, and it was great. So I'm hopeful that we have some programs that are just launching now, and you don't want to peak too soon. So that's one way.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's time to start peaking.
Yeah.
I will tell you this: there's a lot of people have forgotten that the bicentennial was a close-run thing. In that there was also a commission that was established well in advance, and there was political turmoil. You had Watergate, you had the debacle of the end of the Vietnam War, all kinds of troubles, and country was very demoralized at the time. I mean, a lot of people were, what is there to celebrate? There was a People's Bicentennial that was sort of reminding the country of everything bad about America. But at the last minute, and it was later in the season than we are now, two people came along that basically saved the bicentennial. Senator John Warner of Virginia and Warren Burger, then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And they said, we can't have this. We can't blow this. Come on. And so they instituted all the programs that people who were, you're probably too young to remember any of this, but I
am, man.
The bicentennial minutes were a staple on broadcast media. And a lot of people remember them and tell me that they learned a lot from them. We're probably going to do something like that. They also out of the box genius thing that they did in the bicentennial was the tall ships. And that was, I mean, there are very few things in my lifetime that had more of an effect on the populace than that. And who'd have thunk it? A bunch of old ships riding around New York Harbor. The whole country is watching this on television. There are, I think, 8-10 million people lining the harbor to see them. I think we'd have to have a whole other show to talk about why were people so moved by this.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you in a word, I think it had to do with beauty. I think there's a way in which seeing something so beautiful as these old 3- and 4-masted wooden ships just reminded people that and they weren't all America. Most of them. It's not all ugliness.
It's not all ugliness.
Yeah, it's not all ugly.
That's great.
So I've been trying to come up with something similar. It's a little late.
Send your ideas to Bill McClay, care of Hillsdale College.
Yes, right. Well, please do. I do get these. I got just sitting on my desk. I got a letter yesterday from somebody who wants to do a bicentennial mural. I mean, try semiquincentennial mural. And, it's one of the things you hear from people, but some of it's good. And look, I don't discourage anybody from it. But
this is not something we have to wait for a government commission to do. In other words,
exactly. And that's one of the reasons I think our commission may succeed is because of the very fact we couldn't agree on anything politically. I mean, the commission. This is a matter of public record, so I can tell you this. The commission could not agree on whether to call this a celebration or an observance.
Correct.
We never had.
It's worth repeating. Could not agree. Whether to call it a celebration,
this is one of the geniuses of federalism or subsidiarity, whatever you want to call it. That it just so people in the locality say, well, we're not going to sit here in Indiana and do nothing just because you
Right.
guys can't agree on
Yeah.
what time of day it is.
Mhm.
So they're doing things all over the country,
Yeah.
and thank God for it. It's
Yeah.
turning out to be a Tocquevillian effort. And,
I should say, yeah, your state, I'm aware, I believe, at least last I heard, 48 states at least had their own independent commissions.
yeah,
So if you do want to be involved with this, you're listening to this at all, your state has a commission.
yeah, we
There's some
do,
way
we
for you to
do,
plug
we
in.
do.
Yeah.
There are, Virginia has, in my opinion, the best of the state. It's terrific.
It's not
Yeah,
surprising.
I tell you.
Yeah. Well, Bill, thank you for doing this today. Really appreciate your time. Land of Hope is the book. It's out now. Get it. You can get the second edition when that comes out sometime in the future.
December is what we're shooting for. It's not far.
Okay, very good. Excellent. So thanks so much for being with us, Bill.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Jeremy.
Take care. Hey, thanks for joining us for today's podcast. If you enjoyed it, we invite you to subscribe and or rate and or review us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to our podcasts. Thanks a lot.